Enjoy the show. Hey there, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. We're back today with Rich Rubino to do some review on the election, maybe a historic election. We'll see what Rich thinks about that. Welcome back, Rich. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Yeah. And for starts, I thought I would just ask you, given your background, what surprised you about the election results?
A couple of things. Well, I guess first of all, the fact that Donald Trump won all 7 swing states. I didn't expect that at all. Whoever won, I didn't know who was going to win, but I thought one candidate would win 4 or 5 states and the other person would win the other 2 states. It also surprised me specifically a couple of things. One thing, that all those blue wall states, these were Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all respectively went for the Democratic presidential nominee every year from 1992 through 2016. Hillary Clinton lost all 3. Joe Biden won them in 2020. I thought they would at least be split 2-1, one way or the other. My guess was that a state like Michigan, and the polls that I was seeing in Michigan showed that the vice president had a slight lead. I thought she potentially would win there. She did not. I also, thinking about the strategy of both candidates, the fact that Vice President Harris spent so much time in Georgia. She actually spent 2 days, just her and Vice President Walz. So that means you take both candidates out of other states and off the campaign trail in places like Wisconsin. And they rode all around in a bus in southern Georgia and went to some of the more conservative parts of Georgia. Later, they employed Bill Clinton in the state of Georgia. I thought they really thought that they were going to win the state of Georgia. They did not win Georgia. North Carolina, I thought, was going to be hard for them because Trump had won it by about 1.6% last time. In the West, I thought that Vice President Harris had a better chance at Arizona and at least a chance at just about tying Nevada. She lost all those states. And I also found it interesting specifically that Latino men actually voted for Donald Trump. Latinos are invariably a Democratic constituency. Now, I'm being very judicious about that because Latinos are certainly not a monolithic constituency. And while about 43 million of them are Mexican Americans, about 20 million are from other places. And Cuban Americans, for example, particularly older Cuban Americans who came here when Castro took over, are a lot more conservative, and they're particularly very much to favor the economic embargo and continuing it on Cuba, whereas some of the younger Cubans tend to take a divergent position. But that's what I thought was interesting, how he really cleaned house and won all 7 of those showdown states.
Yeah, so the $64,000 question obviously is why do you think that happened? What are, we're seeing a lot of pundits do postmortems now, and but before I share what I think and Brian shares what he thinks, what happened?
First of all, historically, if you have a president whose job approval rating is under 50%, that presidential, whether it's the president running for re-election or whether it's somebody from that president's party running, that party tends to lose. Think, for example, Lyndon Johnson in 1968, Hubert Humphrey lost. Harry Truman in 1952 had a job approval rating of under 30%. Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, lost. Jimmy Carter in 1980 runs for re-election, loses. George H.W. Bush, 1992, loses. So they all had job approval under 50%, and they all landed up losing. So from a historical perspective, Vice President Harris should have lost this election. The other factor is incumbent vice presidents tend to lose when they run to succeed their president. For example, basically, George H.W. Bush won in 1988. It was the first time that an incumbent vice president has actually won to succeed the incumbent president since Martin Van Buren in 1836. So those were the 2 things that she had not have going for her. The other thing she did not have going for her is she was not particularly battle tested in a primary. Now you have to do a cost benefit analysis. On the one hand, I guess you would say she benefited from that because there weren't people who were unified in a faction of a party that ran against her who potentially would have stayed home, like some Hillary voters, for example, would have stayed home in 2008. Not very many, but some did, or potentially were voting third party. But on the other side of that, she did not get battle tested in terms of a lot of the attacks that were going to go her way in the presidential election. It's a lot different running for office when you're running for Senate in California, when your opponent is a Democrat and Congresswoman Sanchez running for that seat, than it is running against a Republican like Donald Trump. So she did not have that. And she's also was very opaque in kind of her answers. She did not seem to give any specifics. And when she was asked on The View specifically what she would do differently than President Biden, she could not come up with any sort of an answer. I go back to 1968. Hubert Humphrey was down by about 15 points to incumbent President Richard Nixon. And on September 30th that year, he gives a speech in Salt Lake City, Utah, and he asseverates that he will support a unilateral bombing halt of North Vietnam as an acceptable risk for peace. That was the version of President Johnson's position. Once he made that statement, all of a sudden people on the left wing of the Democratic Party stopped protesting because he was getting a lot of protests. And Hubert Humphrey came very close. If he had campaigned, if the election had been a week later, he might have actually won. He came very close to winning that election. People started to see him as a differentiation toward President Johnson. Vice President Harris needed to do the exact same thing, and she didn't. I kept thinking that she was going to do something when it came to the war in Gaza, that she would say that she would not have been as hawkish, if you will, as President Joe Biden had been, and maybe the protest would have stopped, and maybe she would have done better in a place like Dearborn, Michigan, where Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, mustered 18% of the vote, but she really did not have anything to differentiate herself. And the other side of that is if the Republicans had a more establishment Republican candidate who was not as divisive as Donald Trump, perhaps at ceteris paribus, all things being equal, that Republican would have won the presidency because the people did not like the economy under the contemporaneous administration.
Right. So, Rich, I'm wondering. There's an idea that a certain percentage of the population are single issue voters.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that still applies the way that it used to? I look at what went on here, and I heard this interesting concept called of luxury beliefs. And, it sort of made me think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that when you talk to people about certain things higher up on that ladder, if they're worried about things lower down, more fundamental, like food, like shelter, like security, physical safety,
mm-hmm.
that things that are a little higher up on that pyramid don't quite trigger them the same way. Do you think that some of that, does the demographic shifts sort of suggest maybe some of that was going on, do you think?
That's interesting hypothesis, and I think there's a lot of accuracy because Vice President Harris would often talk in her speeches, and Joe Biden did when he was a candidate, about saving democracy. And that sounds like a platitude. It sounds like kind of a grand design of the world. The people that are worrying about kitchen table issues are not thinking about democracy. They're not thinking about the war in the world between democracy and autocracy. They're thinking more or less about the inflation, which they believe the Biden administration has not halted, or they believed had effectuated or caused it. I think that I think that those certainly trump some of what Vice President Harris talked about in the foreign policy. But that being said, she did talk a lot about giving a child tax credit. She did talk a lot about her economic plan. It just really kind of went by deaf ears because you keep hearing this invariably from critics of Vice President Harris that the election came down to she talking about identity politics, which was subservient to economic needs. I think she did talk about economic needs, but I think that her critics tried to make her out to be something that well, here's the thing. In 2019, Vice President Harris had to run to the left because Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were both running to president, so she had to run to the left. And she had made statements, for example, about about whether they should be allowed to give sex change to inmates. And she was interviewed, and she suggested the potentially that she could do that. That could be something that could happen in 2024, even though that was certainly not top of mind with voters. Republicans used it in advertisements, and it got to the point where people low propensity voters started to think that was something that Vice President Harris was really starring.
She also tweeted during the Black Lives Matter protests that she was raising money to bail protesters out of jail.
Yeah.
And I think that pigeonholed her also as a far left candidate.
And she was different. She tried to move to the center, talking about how she supported fracking, for example, having Liz Cheney, of all people, campaigning for her, talking about the fact that Dick Cheney had endorsed her, starring the fact that Dick Cheney had endorsed her. So she was trying to run further to the center, but it did not come off as genuine. When candidates run to the center, sometimes they win. Bill Clinton ran to the center in 1992. But in Bill Clinton's case, he had a record in Arkansas of being a centrist governor. So it's not like all of a sudden he just became a centrist overnight. I don't think the American people, particularly those that were kind of in the center, believed that she was their tribune and represented them, because you just see these advertisements and you see what she was saying in 1992. You didn't have, when Jimmy Carter was running in 76, for example, you couldn't go back to Jimmy Carter being governor making a statement like that. You couldn't go back to Bill Clinton being governor making a statement like that, because they had been elected in conservative, at least socially conservative states. And in order to be elected in those states, you can't really move that far to the left. Vice President Harris, on the other hand, she was elected in a very blue state, a very liberal state of California. And when she decided to run for president herself, all the other candidates, pretty much except for Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, were also running to the left. So she had to get to the left of the left. And it really ended up having deleterious effects in 2024.
Now here's a question. I was trying to look at some demographics and try to grasp the basketball of what went on here. And, it seemed like things changed really critically in 2021.
Mhm.
And I saw that the Gallup went from +9 Dems over to +5 GOP. And I also noticed it said, according to federal data, that 2021 was the deadliest year in history. And so that sort of brought me back to that Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, wondering if the public has been like under a certain bombardment of, we've talked about cognitive models that people have lining up to what their priorities are. And so I'm wondering if something didn't shift across there, and, sort of maybe the Dems got a little bit thrown from the horse because the psychological landscape changed in those times. I mean, is there other things that you can think of that shifted in there that are part of that?
That's an interesting supposition. I do agree with it. I think that the Democrats could not get. I think that in 2021 with and I think certainly 2020 with the COVID pandemic and then the George Floyd protests, I think that a lot of Democrats tried to get to the left, talking about defunding the police, talking about fracking. I think the fact that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were both viable candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. Other candidates had to show that they were also liberal. By 2021, as like you're saying, the country shifted ideologically a little bit, and certainly the Democratic Party, the left wing of the Democratic Party, was not the consensus view. Maybe it was in certain factions of the Democratic Party, but certainly not in the country as a whole. And the candidates could not get to the center fast enough. Many of them that had taken those liberal positions, and they're on tape now taking those liberal positions in 2020. By 2021, it was a lot different. It reminds me a little bit, frankly, of the Republicans in terms of foreign policy. Donald Trump, whatever you think of him, he shifted the ideology from foreign policy from interventionist, hawkish foreign policy to non-interventionist, more of a realism foreign policy. So a lot of the neoconservatives, for example, who were very much in the camp of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, folks like Lindsey Graham, in order for him to survive, he has to become a Trump Republican. Otherwise, what's Donald Trump going to do? Donald Trump's going to support a primary opponent against him in South Carolina. And Donald Trump's a lot more popular in South Carolina than Lindsey Graham is with the Republican constituency. So Lindsey Graham has to move his views. Marco Rubio now, who was campaigning in 2016 as a hawk, now all of a sudden he's accepting a nomination of Donald Trump as vice president. So Donald Trump has really shifted the Republican Party. And other Republicans, it's either you to preserve themselves, knowing he's the leader of the party, they have to also shift their ideology. It's like it's very interesting in American politics. A lot of people are very unbending and they have a lot of principles. But when it really comes to it, lots of times they're willing to make transmogrifications for political survival, even though they may not agree with their new position.
Yeah, I was listening to Sam Harris.
Mm-hmm.
He recorded a take this morning and was kind of saying that while Kamala moved away from identity politics during this campaign and also like away from other far left positions like supporting Hamas and things like that, she didn't ever vocally support Hamas. But
No.
what Sam Harris said was that she was talking out of both sides of her mouth. Like there was a protester who stood up at one of her campaign events and saying we need an arms embargo against Israel. And
Yep.
while he was getting kicked out of the protest, she said, "But he has a point," right? So like kind of trying to play it both ways in real time.
Yes, and that's interesting because the Joe Biden, Vice President Harris, that administration was very much supportive of Israel and the conflict. There was not to talk of an arms embargo. Certainly, they were very much, while Joe Biden tried to keep his distance a little bit, and as did Vice President Harris from Benjamin Netanyahu, they pretty much gave them everything that they wanted. And there are a lot of people on the left wing of the Democratic Party and the Green Party that believe that the Biden administration is responsible for the 43,000 civilian deaths in Gaza. Now, where do you go from there? If you're living in Dearborn, Michigan, for example, where Joe Biden used to be very popular, Joe Biden won 86% of the Arab and Muslim American votes in 2020. This time around, many of those voters are either went to Donald Trump or went to Jill Stein. And it reminds me so much of Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Many people on the left wing of the Democratic Party who theoretically would have been sympathetic to President Johnson and probably voted for him in 1964 believe that he was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people in Vietnam. Those people, it's very hard to get those people back, say, well, yeah, but look what we did with civil rights, look what we did with Medicare. In the case of Vice President Harris, she really did not have an answer other than to try to straddle the line in many respects. I think that the protesters, many of them would have gone to her side. They would not have been with Jill Stein because they certainly would not have been for Donald Trump. If she did say that, I would support an arms embargo. But the idea that she would support an arms embargo from a purely calculated political perspective, that would have caused indignation amongst the Jewish community. And many moderate Jewish Democrats, I think, would have either voted for Donald Trump or potentially would have stayed home.
I think they did anyway.
Yeah. And so could we I just would like to sort of draw the strategic problem there. We've referred to this before. You spoke it when we talked with you the last time about how a politician, as they sort of go up the ladder, they start to represent different constituencies. And so they have to sort of move based on those constituencies. But, I spoke before in one of our other episodes about a famous episode in history with a Roman general. And he was sieging a town. And while he was sieging the town, some other army came up behind him to try to relieve the town he was besieging. So he had a siege wall around the town. And then he had another siege wall around behind him to protect him from the people on the outside. And I thought, this is a great example of the situation that a politician is kind of in because, we talked about the different changing of the guard on the outside and that strategic problem. But within the party and the party politics to keep position and to keep leverage, there's a whole other strategic issue. And sometimes those are not mutually tenable to solve the problem on the inside with the same solution that also impacts. Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you speak to that problem? I mean, you did kind of in specific, but this is not new, is it?
No, and in the United States, we have catch-all parties, meaning that as opposed to having an ideological party, both parties try to catch as many constituencies as possible. There are more narrow political parties like the Green Party, like the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party, but they appeal to a very narrow cross-section of constituencies. In this country, we have a system of two major parties, and both parties try to appeal both to the center and to the left and the right wing of their own constituencies. And sometimes that's hard because, on the one hand, you're trying to appeal to conservatives, at least in your party, and you're also trying to appeal to liberals and moderates in your party. So it's very interesting in other countries. It's not like that. In Israel, for example, there are 39 political parties that are in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. So there are constituencies that if you want somebody that's going to be with you 100% of the time, you have a very good chance of having somebody with that ideology in the parliament. Very hard in the United States. It's very hard in the United States because especially if you're running for Senate, you're running for governor, and you're in a swing state, a place like Wisconsin. It's kind of like, in the one hand, you can't go too far right, you can't go too far left, and then you say something that's critical of the Israeli government, all of a sudden you have a constituency that's traditionally Democrat that's going to be angry at you. Then you say something that is critical of that's something that is more critical of the pro-Palestinian demonstrators, and all of a sudden they're the ones that are protesting you. So you're really kind of in the middle of that, and it's a matter of a very dexterous politician is somebody that can really kind of play to the center and can be able to get at least somewhat support, even if it's lukewarm support from both constituencies. And I think in the case of Joe Biden, I think that particularly the Muslim and Arab constituencies simply did not trust him. I think that in terms of the Jewish constituencies in the Democratic Party, they were very much with him. But, obviously it all comes down to a cost benefit analysis. And if you're looking at this purely as a cold, calculated political calculus, and you're not looking in them, and you take any sort of ideology or morals or ethics out of it, it's very, you just look at which constituency is going to benefit you the most. You go to that constituency, and then you try to get as much support with that constituency, and then perhaps you isolate the other one.
Now, is there, one of the things I think we've all noticed is that astronomical sums of money that were involved in this race. Now, do the funders now put a further complication on that with that, who all you have to keep happy on the inside? And did we see something significant in this that, I think that we've also had a feeling at times that money was the thing that determined who won. And yet in this election, we didn't see that at all, did we?
Oh, no, absolutely. The funders have a lot to do with that. There are different types of funders. There are those who are potentially giving money not because they're ideologues, but because they want some sort of a benefit from you. So you give a certain amount of money to a candidate, you give money to a super PAC, then they become president. You want a tax break, you want to have some sort of relations with that politician, whether it's a state representative at the local level all the way up to president. You've given them money, you're probably going to be on their Rolodex. So that's the reason they give. They might even give to people running against each other, because it's not about wanting some certain ideology. It's just about wanting them to benefit you. And you see sometimes businessmen, folks on Wall Street, lobbyists will do that for their own self-interest. Then there are those who are there for either maybe perhaps a single issue, and that's why they're giving to somebody, or they're potentially just have an ideology and they want to give somebody who's sympathetic to their ideology. But for the most part, the one kind of recurring motif in here is that whoever gets elected to office, you want them to at least give you a meeting, and you want them to be sympathetic to your concerns. Very rarely do people just give money to a campaign and not care what the politician actually does.
And so now we saw that Harris outspent Trump by a huge amount, and yet that didn't actually provide the traction that they thought it would. Do you have any thoughts about that in particular? Was it just bad spends?
I think they did do some bad spending, but the Republicans did too. I mean, right, Donald Trump was campaigning in Virginia. Virginia was a state that's pretty much that we knew was going to go blue, barring a cataclysm. He was in New Mexico the weekend before the election. Why was he in New Mexico? New Mexico is not going to be a red state, and if it is going to be a red state, then I think he's going to win in a landslide anyway. So there's probably no point in spending time there. That was time he could have spent in Georgia or North Carolina, as beautiful as New Mexico is, especially Santa Fe. But he spent time. I think he misallocated the money as well, or for that matter, going to Madison Square Garden. The time he spent in Madison Square Garden, he could have spent that time in Wisconsin. So he did some really bizarre strategies there that I really can't think of, kind of why he necessarily did that. In the case of Harris, she spent most of her time in the actual swing states, and she focused on them. She made a couple of detours to places like Texas and New Hampshire that weren't really swing states. But other than that, I think she spent her money in the right places. I think part of it might be that the country just at the end of the day is so bifurcated, and it's very hard for any candidate to try to get a voter from the other side. And Donald Trump was obviously better at it, and there may even been a lot of surreptitious Trump voters that weren't telling pollsters they're going to vote for Trump, but then at the end of the day, voted for Donald Trump.
I think the Madison Square Garden event for Trump was a national event. I mean, I think it was intended that way. So I actually think that was symbolic.
Yeah.
I don't mean it was Nazi propaganda like some of the media was saying, but I thought it was like, that's his home city. And he had more of a show. He had more guests appearing at that one. I think that was where the Puerto Rico joke happened.
Yep.
And so I thought that was like a symbolic statement that, like, I'm in the biggest arena in the country, brand wise.
What about the Virginia, New Mexico appearances?
Yeah, I agree with you on those. I don't understand why he was in New Mexico or Virginia.
It's a
Yeah,
beautiful state. I mean, I can see why, but
it is. Yeah, yeah. I wanted to go back to something. Well, I wanted to put an asterisk because you said 43,000 civilians in Gaza, and I just want to say that number is reported by the Gaza
of the
Health
Gaza
Ministry, which
Health
is
Ministry,
run by
right?
Hamas, and it's very much disputed. So I just have to say that.
Yes, I was just saying it. I was just saying that was the argument that they were making, not that it was necessarily the validity of it.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned Marco Rubio earlier, and I think there's like a whole topic there, not just about Rubio specifically, but about what the choices Trump is already making for his administration represent. Right? I think he already chose a head of, is it Homeland Security or just the border?
The border.
And yeah, and then he is talking about this isn't an administrative choice for him, but the Senate leader, right, is up for grabs, and he's got a voice in that. And so, kind of, what are you seeing in terms of how the team is coalescing and how these dominoes are starting to fall?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of the leadership of the United States Senate, I think that you have a couple of choices. John Thune is would be the establishment choice. Probably the people in the Senate would probably favor him. But he's somebody who supported Tim Scott for president. He was never really a Trump Republican. He's criticized Donald Trump in the past, so I don't think that the Trump administration would want him to be the leader. I think that Marco Rubio actually came out immediately and said he supported Rick Scott a couple days before, which I think probably the Trump administration favors him. He's somebody who's very much a Trump Republican from Trump's adopted home state. You have certainly other choices as well. John Cornyn from Texas was never really a Trump Republican. So I think the Trump administration will probably say publicly that they're not endorsing anyone, but probably behind the scenes, they're going to do everything they can to make it so that Rick Scott, who's very much a MAGA Republican, becomes the Senate Majority Leader. In terms of the people he's appointed, I was very interested in Marco Rubio becoming Secretary of State because Marco Rubio is antithetical to just about everything that Donald Trump believes. Marco Rubio was the Hawk's hawk. He said as late as 2015 that he favored the invasion of Iraq. He's somebody who's, for example, voted to make it harder for the president to get out of NATO. He's very much an interventionist in foreign policy. He has a doctrine that says that there's no understudy, he said this himself, to the United States in terms of foreign policy, that there should be an interventionist foreign policy, and he was extremely critical of Donald Trump. Go back to 2016, 2015, when the two men were running against each other, where Donald Trump called him Little Marco. But during that debate, if you remember that, it was very interesting also because Marco Rubio tried to criticize Donald Trump. At one point, Donald Trump says, you don't know anything about business. To Donald Trump, Marco Rubio acerbated something to the effect of, well, I don't know anything about about putting my business into bankruptcy 4 times. So, these are really vicious battles, Barry L, that these two people had. Somehow they were able to have a reconcile or rapprochement, if you will, but be fascinating to see what the foreign policy of the Trump administration is, if he really is a non-interventionist, which he advertised himself to be, or if he is going to be some sort of an interventionist superhawk. And nominating Marco Rubio is a very interesting choice. It's very hard to think historically of an example when a president chose somebody who is very much a critic of their policy and has a completely different foreign policy at the highest position in the cabinet.
Right.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that too, and I mean, part of it, Trump's personality kind of shows up there because I think part of his focus on loving deals and loving business is a mindset that it's all business, and there can be like all this rancor between him and somebody one day, and then the next day they're making a deal. I don't think he'll ever be in that situation with Rosie O'Donnell, but
Secretary of the Interior.
yeah, right. But we've seen him like make friends with a lot of people that it seemed like that's never going to happen.
I think that's partly the way he's changed the Republican Party. I mean, the people he ran against in 2016, this was not a very cordial campaign. I remember Ted Cruz. I remember him calling him
Yeah.
Lion Ted. And then I remember the day of the Wisconsin primary when he suggested, because of something that was in the National Enquirer, that Ted Cruz's father was somehow involved with the killing of JFK. I mean, this is not, I disagree with your budget proposal. This is, I mean, he criticized his wife. I mean, he really went after the guy. I mean, this is no holds bar. And now Ted Cruz runs for re-election in 2018 against Beto O'Rourke. Trump comes and campaigns for him. 2024, Ted Cruz is best friends with Donald Trump. Rick Perry had a very, Donald Trump suggested that Rick Perry was stupid. Rick Perry became his energy secretary. Rand Paul, something Donald Trump, remember, he said, "You're not having a good night, Rand." They really went after each other. Then Rand Paul becomes one of the biggest advocates of Donald Trump. And the biggest example was South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham.
I thought you were going to say Chris Christie because he's the biggest example.
Well, that's another one. But Lindsey Graham, there was one point where Donald Trump, because he had written his cell phone number, remember this, on a piece of paper. Donald Trump gets up at a speech and he gives the entire American public Lindsey Graham's cell phone number. That's how bitter these two were against. And now Lindsey Graham is the biggest advocate of Donald Trump there is. And Chris Christie is another example. He was on the short list to be vice president with Donald Trump. It came down to Newt Gingrich, Mike Pence, and Chris Christie. Eventually, it went to Mike Pence, but Chris Christie, was a very good soldier. He was involved with the debates, preparing Donald Trump. But he's somebody, obviously, and Chris Christie, unlike Lindsey Graham or Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, kind of left the reservation.
What do you see for some of the other appointments? I think there are some early signals, right? You're closer to it than we are.
From what I've heard, he's seriously considering Whoopi Goldberg as energy secretary. No.
She's got a lot of energy.
He's going to take all the people in the View and give them cabinet positions as a way to reconcile and see what they.
Well, I did have a question about that.
I don't think you'll see Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lori Boebert in the administration, because I don't think even in a Republican Senate, they would get confirmation. Now, that being said, maybe in a White House position.
Right. Well, but almost in that position is my man Bobby Kay.
That's interesting, right? Yes.
And what I heard him say, and maybe you can tell me whether I misheard this, he said that they got about a 20-person transition team, and that it was 0% corporate lobbyists, and that ordinarily it would be 100% corporate lobbyists. So my question I wrote down here is, can that be true, or is it the worms?
That's a really good question. I guess it comes on what you define as corporate lobbyist. If you mean somebody who's a Wall Street executive, he certainly has that on his transition team. Obviously, not somebody that's directly necessarily lobbying for a corporation, but certainly people that run companies, run banks are certainly on the transition team. But perhaps in a very technical sense, he's probably accurate.
Oh, interesting. So this relates to another question. I saw again on the demographics that it seemed like the Amish were voting in the same way that the 18 to 21-year-olds are. And so, my question, and this I guess is related to the money question, is here, let me do this right. Was this all a reaction to the deep state?
Well, that would be the argument that Trump has been making for time immemorial now, that there is a deep state that is very much anti-Trump. And I think that that is certainly Robert RFK Jr., when he had a hat that said on it, RFK Jr. for president, defund the deep state. And that was certainly part of his platform. But I don't know if you need the tinfoil yet.
So are we seeing that thing that we talked about where the two sides of the spectrum aren't a spectrum, they meet in the middle, and is anti-authoritarianism maybe one of the ways in places that they meet, do you think?
It is. There's an anti-authoritarianism that's the right and the left, I think, and that's when the right meets the left sometimes. I think there's a libertarian right that really says, I want government off my back, that's very consistent about that. They say, we want government off the back. They're kind of saying, essentially, they're kind of the rebels, if you will, the ones that perhaps you think about in school, the ones that would not show up for class because they would say, I don't want to listen to an authority figure. But that's also people on the left, too. The people who are the hippies, the people that the people that listen to death metal, they're also the ones saying, I don't want to go to class because I don't want to listen to authority. So they're right and the left. Now, the people on the left, may be people that actually favor government in many respects, the people that are right or not, but they have that kind of anti-authority ethos, and that's a recurring motif. But the interesting thing here, and this is where, when people define right and left, when you come to an issue like anarchy, anarchy is considered a left-wing philosophy, which makes no sense to me, because this is where right meets left. Again, anarchy should be a right-wing philosophy, because if you believe in less government, and then you get to being conservative, then you're a libertarian. If you keep going, you're an anarchist. Now, on the other side of that, if you believe in more government, you start as a liberal, then you go to a socialist, then you go to a communist. The next logical step is not anarchy. This is the antithesis of anarchy. This is saying we want government to nationalize industries, but for some reason, anarchy is considered a left-wing ideology, and that always boggled my mind.
Right, because it's all about individual freedom.
It should be that should be the tribune of the ideal of conservatism, should be to get to the point where you have no government whatsoever. Not the ideal of extreme liberalism should be the idea that the federal government comes in and nationalizes all industries.
And is that what we saw this time? A kind of a reaction to that? I mean, we had the government telling people they had to take shots or they'd lose their job. We had a real push. We kind of maybe a connection between the big media that were sort of all marching in lockstep. And then all of a sudden, I mean, that's why maybe I better put this back on, because my question here is, I see polls that say 70% of people are unhappy with the direction that things are going. And then I see interview that says, what would you change? I off of the top of my head, I can't think of a thing. And so I wonder, is this like a boxer who's throwing the fight, who's getting paid pretty well to throw the fight?
I don't think so.
Did they really, are they really surprised when those two things were side by side, juxtaposed, and the American public is, ostensibly hurting? Did they throw the game, do you think? Or were they just in a bubble world?
No, I think she was very much in a bubble world. And also, this is why you have primaries, and this is why it benefits a candidate to have a primary. If she had a primary, she would have been asked that question ad nauseum. And the first time she was asked, if she gave an answer like that, that would have been a warm-up. Someone would have gone to her and say, you need to really give a different answer. She would have given a different answer. She probably would have lost a few points in the polls, and then she would have said, well, I differ from Vice President. I differ from Joe Biden on this. She didn't do that. And in the general election, her staff, this is where your staff prepares you. You have to say something that you disagree with. If you're president, if you're at 67% job approval rating and you're asked that question, the economy's in great shape, like Bill Clinton in 2000, for example, Al Gore could have just said, no, let's just keep the economy going. Al Gore's mistake, he talked about the people versus the powerful and tried to run on a divergent platform from Bill Clinton. All he had to do was say, I want to continue what's going on under the Clinton administration. In this case, you have to say something to the effect, and obviously you praise him because he's your boss. You say, we've done a lot of great work. And then you say, we've done the infrastructure plan, but I really disagree with him on this. Now, I'll say the problem with saying that is the critic is going to say, well, if you're such a powerful vice president, you're the last one in the room, why didn't you tell the president to do that? And why didn't you convince him? Don't you have the persuasion skills to do that? So you are kind of caught between a rock and the hard place. But anytime you have a president who's under 50% and the country believes they're on the wrong track, you better have something that you say, I really disagreed with the president on this. I even go back to, even in 2000, the other thing, Al Gore, again, there was one issue that was, remember Elian Gonzalez, the Cuban refugee who came over? Al Gore took a divergent position on that. Even he was willing to take a divergent issue on something. Vice President Harris was not willing to take any sort of divergent issues, and the country was saying we want somebody other than Joe Biden, and Joe Biden's understudy is not what we want.
Now, do you think if she presented like Susie Wiles rather than the way that she does, would she have done better? I mean, a more Thatchery kind of matronly, everything under control sort of a vibe?
I think she was trying to present that to a certain degree when she had all these moderate Republicans like Adam Kinzinger, and not only moderate Republicans, but conservative Republicans, rock-rib conservatives like Lynn Cheney campaigning. She was trying to show that I'm the adult in the room. I understand foreign policy. So I think she was trying to do that. I just think it kind of fell on deaf ears. And I wonder, I haven't seen any studies of this yet, but I wonder if there's been a deleterious effect of having someone like Lynn Cheney, if that is depressed people, older people on the left wing of the Democratic Party who remembered her father, who didn't like her father, because in 2006 to 2008, her father was one of the most unpopular people in the country. And I don't think that starring him, Dick Cheney, as somebody who endorsed, or his daughter, is going to consolidate the base. I don't see who is the voter out there that is saying, well, Lynn Cheney supports her, so I'm going to support her on the one side. But I can see somebody on the left wing of the Democratic Party that's very hesitant to support her in the first place. This could be the reason they voted for Jill Stein, or the reason they didn't vote, or even voted for Donald Trump.
So going back to the bubble that Harris and her campaign might have been in, and I think this goes back to the question about good spending and bad spending. You're probably right that she was mostly in the right places. But a lot of her spending was on Beyonce and Oprah Winfrey and kind of Hollywood and pop culture and Taylor Swift. I don't know if she actually spent money on Taylor Swift, but you know, but the culture of the campaign, or the brand of the campaign, was kind of about pop culture. And was that just to get young people, or why do you think she focused so much on that, and why did it backfire?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think back, remember Jerry Brown, former governor of California? The first time he ran for president in 1980, he would have groups like he would have rock groups, famous rock groups, appear at some of his rallies, and it never translated into votes because a lot of people just came there to hear the band, and they couldn't care less who this Jerry Brown guy was. They just wanted a free concert. I've heard that the same thing with John Kerry in 2004 would have some of these bands out playing. Some people just came to hear the concert, so it doesn't necessarily translate into votes. But it is a problem that the Democrats have, and they have the problem is they're no longer seen as the tribune of the working class or the downscale on the economic ladder. They're seen as an elitist party, and having Hollywood actors, on the one hand, it can bring in a lot of money. Whether it's them donating themselves or it's people coming to fundraisers to listen to them. But it gives the feeling to people who are kind of in the middle of the political spectrum, or someone who's a conservative Democrat in Macomb County, that the Democrats are just the party of the elitists. That's why, for example, some presidential candidates have been successful in trying to inoculate them from that criticism. I remember Bill Clinton, for example, when he was president, after he had signed the ban on semi-automatic rifles, went to Arkansas and went duck hunting. And he came back with you can see it on YouTube, picture of him in duck hunting clothes, and he's got the duck right here. That's saying that I'm not one of those elitists, that I'm somebody that's actually going to go duck hunting in Arkansas, and I've experience doing that. Tim Walz, for all the criticism of why she chose him, and there's a lot of it is justified, one thing Tim Walz is he's a rural Democrat he represented a rural district in southern Minnesota, somewhat conservative district. He's from Nebraska. He's somebody who is a hunter. He's someone who's won sharpshooting contest with, among other hunters in the United States Congress. He's a football coach, somebody who can appeal to that demographic. Now, I don't think he did appeal to that demographic. And I think that historically, the question is going to be, if she had chosen Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, would she have done better, and would she have potentially have won Pennsylvania? But I understand why she wanted him, because Tim Walz is many things, but an elitist is very hard to say Tim Walz is an elitist, whereas I think a lot of other Democrats, Vice President Harris being one of them, are able to come off oftentimes as elitist, or kind of looking down toward Americans, and that's certainly a criticism that Democrats have. And whoever they nominate in 2020 has to be somebody who speaks like a normal American. Politics is not like any other profession. In other professions, if you go to Harvard, you go to Yale, you go to Princeton, you show that off. If you want to get a job in finance and you have a Harvard degree, you show that off. If you're running for office and you didn't go to college, you show that off, because people do not want somebody that's going to be better than them, that's going to be seen as intellectual. It's just such a different field. And George W. Bush, actually, when he first ran for Congress, a guy named Kent Hance was his opponent, and Kent Hance said at the time, Texas Tech plays better in the 19th Congressional District than Harvard and Yale. And Kent Hance got elected. So after that, Bush said, I'm never going to get out Texan again, developed a little bit of an accent, and by 1994, nobody saw him as an elitist who went to these Ivy League schools. They saw him as a Texan, and he beat Ann Richards.
So you just touched on a question that Brian raised before you got on, as we were doing a little pre-meeting, which is and Brian, maybe you want to put more color on this, but the topic was, is there a party of the working class now?
Yeah, like, does labor have any friends in this fray?
That's
actually a question from Cornell West. You could probably
that's
predict that.
that's the argument that people on the left make, and that's the argument that Cornell West made. Cornell West had a very distinct argument on foreign policy. For example, Cornell West was very critical of the Biden administration. He didn't. I don't think he was the fear that the Biden administration had. I think Jill Stein was the fear that they had. That's why there were actually advertisements that the Harris campaign ran in Michigan to try to criticize Jill Stein, saying that she was essentially that you vote for Trump, vote for Stein is to vote for Trump. But that's the critic size you have sometimes in the left wing of the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders is making that criticism today. He's saying that the Democratic Party is kind of abandoned, has abandoned the working class. But it is something that theoretically the Democratic Party in its contemporaneous form should be the party of the working class. And Vice President Harris, at least her message was tailored to the middle class, but it never necessarily gained traction with the middle class, because many members of the middle class view her as kind of an elitist, and it's really an undercurrent of virulence toward elitism. Now, does either party really represent the working class? Well, it's nuanced. On the one hand, you could say that Trump, with his opposition to some of the trade pacts, opposition to NAFTA, for example, getting out of NAFTA, there are a lot of workers that would benefit from that. On the other hand, his tariffs, there are a lot of people, a lot of middle class voters that are going to have to spend a lot of money because if he institutes these tariffs, because they're going to have to buy American. So it really kind of works both ways. On the Democratic side, I think that economic issues, certainly issues like the child tax credit, for example, would be something that would benefit the working class. But I think that the working class also, and I think that many of the socially conservative voters, labor voters, for example, are kind of moving away from the Democratic Party because what they view as their elitism and they view as their social liberalism. I don't know what you do about that, but certainly when you have a catch-all party, on the one hand, you have to appeal to different constituencies. Certainly the abortion rights constituencies, for example. But on the other side, you do have a lot of more socially conservative Democrats who are kind of economically populist that are really kind of being turned off by that.
Right. And we saw the unions not coming out to support like we would have expected for years and years.
Not only that, but Donald Trump actually had a union leader come and speak at the Republican National Convention, which is absolutely unheard of. He didn't make an endorsement, but just the fact that he actually came, the head of the Teamsters, and made a speech at the Republican National Convention. And when J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, gave his speech, he criticized Joe Biden on a couple of things. He criticized him for supporting the Iraq War, and he criticized him for supporting NAFTA. Go back to 1993, when NAFTA was passed. The Republicans got it through. Bill Clinton signed it, and there was the Republicans that really got it through the House and the Senate. They were the free trade party. In 2002, 2003, when George W. Bush was launching the invasion of Iraq, only in the United States Senate, only Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island, who eventually became a Democrat himself, voted for the resolution to go into the war in Iraq. So Donald Trump has really changed the party, and he's made it into a party that, whether it helps labor or not, at least is perceived as more labor friendly than certainly it was under George W. Bush.
Right. And now his election really does complete the parallels that we spoke about in our first conversation with my friend Grover. And I was interested in the role that tariffs played in that same chapter. Although, to remind folks, Benjamin Harrison, who was the in-between, the Biden of the Grover Cleveland version of it, he was actually a pro-tariff Republican.
Yes.
And Grover, who was, and I always remember that Grover was Democrat because Grover on Sesame Street is blue, which we spoke about. He was actually talking about backing down the tariffs a little bit and creating some space for the folks that hit. And that's what got him elected his second term, wasn't it?
Yeah, anytime you mention Benjamin Harrison, the ratings absolutely skyrocket on any sort of any podcaster. I think Howard Stern's doing a show tomorrow about Benjamin Harrison and the presidency, and
Hey, my old Benjamin T-shirts have all worn out. I need new ones.
I'm sure he's going to interview some Benjamin Harrison scholars tomorrow. Ben, it was an interesting time, and we're hearing a lot of how it mirrors that time in history. So what happened, for some background, Grover Cleveland's governor of New York, gets elected president in 1884, serves out his full term, and loses re-election to Benjamin Harrison. He won the national popular vote, but loses the Electoral College. The last day in the White House, which was called the Executive Mansion at that time, Frances Folsom Cleveland, Cleveland's wife, said to the White House staff, "Keep the place nice. We'll be back in 4 years." 1892, Benjamin Harrison is relatively unpopular, and Grover Cleveland runs for the Democratic nomination again. This is before we had primaries, so he runs, and he has an opponent in David Hill, who was his lieutenant governor when Cleveland was governor. Then Cleveland becomes president. Hill becomes governor of New York, runs against him and defeats Hill at the convention. Then goes on and defeats Benjamin Harrison for president. And at the time, the Republican Party was more or less the liberal party. At least at least based on today's standards, they would have been the liberal party. And one thing they favored higher tariffs. Grover Cleveland favored lower tariffs. When Grover Cleveland gets elected, 1893, the country goes into the Panic of 1893. There's a Great Depression. Grover Cleveland is extremely unpopular. And in 1896, Grover Cleveland loses a record number, 127 seats in the United States House of Representatives. The Democrats lost that year. 1896, the time he could run for re-election, he was so unpopular that he didn't even seek re-election, and the party nominated William Jennings Bryan, who was about as divergent ideologically from the Democratic Party and Grover Cleveland's ideology as you could get.
So if I'm a Democratic strategist now, I'm thinking one of two things. One is, okay, we got to put our heads down, stop talking about that far left stuff, wait out the next 4 years, and run a centrist business in 2028. The other approach would be, we really have to take a hard look at ourselves, look to a new generation of leaders in the Democratic Party, and rebuild the platform. What do you see happening, and who do we know who those? If there is a new generation of leaders, do we know who they are, what that platform might consist of? Where do you see them going?
And do the Democrats that survived this red wave give us any clues to that?
That's a great question. And there are certainly, there are younger Democrats. You're going to hear a lot of their names, a lot of in the next few years. Hakeem Jeffries, a congressman from New York, who will not be speaker, but will be minority leader. He's going to be the voice of the opposition, if you will. I think Chuck Schumer in the United States Senate, I think Chuck Schumer will probably give way a little bit. Hakeem Jeffries, you're going to have two New Yorkers really taking him on, because the thought process is that Hakeem Jeffries theoretically could become speaker in 2026. Usually, a party in a 6th year of a presidency, Bill Clinton in 1998, after the House was considering impeaching him and people did not want that, there was a backlash. The party picked up seats the first time since James Monroe in 1822. So theoretically, it's almost a certainty that the party will lose seats and probably lose the House in 2026. And then he will be the real voice of the opposition. And Chuck Schumer will probably fade as the minority leader or the majority leader, at least fade in terms of public perception, or whoever comes in eventually and succeeds Chuck Schumer in that leadership position. So I think you'll hear a lot from him. I think that you always hear a bunch of governors' names. I think Governor Cooper from North Carolina is somebody who's been elected in a red state, never lost, or at least a red state when he first elected. Now it's becoming more purple. Never lost. I think Southern accented governors or former governors like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton tend to do very well with a national constituency, because it's very hard to tether them to the far left if they've already been elected in a moderate or conservative state. I think Governor Shapiro probably, the fact that he was not on the ticket, I think a lot of Democrats are going to look at them and are going to look at themselves and say, what if we had put him on the ticket? And that's going to benefit him, because in 2028, a lot of people are going to say, what if we had picked this guy on the ticket? This guy was dynamic. This guy could have been the one who would have won the nomination for Harris. So maybe that will help him in 2028. Plus, it got him a lot of name recognition by being considered as a vice presidential nominee. He's got a couple of things he's got to think about. One of them is, does he run for re-election in 2026? If he's going to run for president in 2028 and it gets to be a close election in 2026, at some point, the question's going to be asked, will you serve out your full term? and he might have to bite the bullet and say that he will serve out his full term. I think the best thing for him to do would be to do the same thing that, if he's seriously considering running for president, is do what Mitt Romney did. When Mitt Romney got elected in 2002, in 2006 he did not seek re-election, and that gave that that took that away from him, and he was able to run for president as a kind of a former governor. Shapiro also has the possibility that he could lose re-election because Pennsylvania is very much a swing state. We don't know how popular he'll be at that time, in which case he'll have no political career. So I think his best strategy is to not run for re-election, not have the trappings of the governorship of Pennsylvania, and spend an inordinate amount of time running for office. And then you're going to have more Democrats that have come out and have kind of criticized the Democratic Party, like Seth Moulton from Massachusetts, for example, who, I don't know if you saw this, but he criticized the Democratic Party and saying that they were basically too sympathetic to the idea of transgendered athletes in sports. He said, I have two daughters, and I don't want my daughters on the field with somebody who's a biological male, for example. And this effectuated a firestorm of criticism. The Salem, Massachusetts, for example, the mayor of Salem and in his district and the entire city council signed a letter basically disavowing it. Steve Kerrigan, the chairman of the Democratic Party, disavowed that. But he's really kind of putting himself up there as for this bona fides of someone who's going to take on the party establishment. Jared Golden, congressman from northern Maine, somebody who I think is also a veteran, is also taken on the party establishment. I think you're going to hear his name as kind of the new Joe Manchin, if you will. He'll be somebody who's really kind of be in the center and kind of negotiate some deals in the problem solvers caucus. And there's also some of the new Democrats got elected to the Senate. Angela also Brooks, for example, from Maryland, who just defeated Larry Hogan, African-American woman, young, very charismatic. She's somebody, and I think you might see Lisa Blunt Rochester, who just won a seat in the United States Senate in Delaware. Also young African-American. She's somebody who I think potentially could be on a ticket in 2028, or potentially, I don't think she'll run for president, but I think she could be on a ticket. So there are a lot of choices for the Democrats to choose from in 2028. And I think that it could be very beneficial for them. The problem is they're going to have probably a very bitter primary, and whoever comes out on the top is going to have to do a lot to reconcile all the different factions who supported one of their opponents. And there's going to have to be a successor to Bernie Sanders. My guess is it's going to be Ro Khanna, congressman from California, out in Silicon Valley. But if it's not him, it's going to be someone else, because he really represents a certain wing of the Democratic Party that's not going away.
So that's a interesting list of names. I'll have to research some of those. From a policy standpoint, though, it sounds like you think the Democrats are moving center.
I do. Well, the Democrats is not a monolithic term. I think that there are always going to be voices on the left wing. There's going to be the squad of the Democratic Party. There's going to be a Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party in the United States Senate. He just got reelected overwhelmingly. But there'll be other people that'll be more sympathetic with him, Jeff Merkley, for example, in Oregon, ideologically. But I think the majority of Democrats who are going to run in 2028 are going to be more centrist-minded Democrats. It reminds me a little bit of 1992, when pretty much every candidate except Tom Harkin was trying to run as somewhat of a centrist, because the party had lost 3 elections in a row, and they really wanted to win that election. So they nominated Bill Clinton, even though Bill Clinton had some positions on requiring mandatory teacher testing, supporting capital punishment, for example, that were kind of anathema to traditional free trade, to traditional democratic values. But you had Clinton, you had Paul Tsongas, you had Bob Kerrey running, you had Doug Wilder running, and they were all trying to run to the center.
And regarding the center, it seems like, in history, after a landslide, there's 2 ways you can go. You can push it further, or you can come back as a conciliatory thing. Do we see yet what we expect out of Trump?
Out of Trump? Oh, that's a good question. I thought you meant out of the Democrats. That's a good question, because in Trump's case, he might make the mistake, at least, that parties tend to make after they win a landslide, after they win an election by a solid amount. They tend to go too far to the right or too far to the left, and they tend to try to misread their mandate. For example, whether it was Bill Clinton in 1992, with all of a sudden he proposed Hillary Care, that healthcare reform legislation, it was seen as too ambitious. 1994, the party lost 53 seats in the House of Representatives. It was seen as he kind of over-interpreted his mandate, if you will. Then in 1998, the Republicans probably overinterpreted their mandate by trying to impeach Bill Clinton. George W. Bush, I think in 2004, overinterpreted his mandate and he said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to try to reform Social Security. Voters did not want that. He was going all around the country talking about the need to reform Social Security. 2006, Nancy Pelosi becomes the first Democrat speaker since 1994. Barack Obama, first year as administration, you had Obamacare at the time, unpopular and popular now. 2012, the party loses 63 seats, the biggest margin of any party since 1938 with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who himself had a mandate when he was reelected in 1936, only losing 2 states. In 1937-38, he proposed a proposal that the president would be allowed to nominate justices. For every justice over 70 years old, he could nominate another justice. And this court packing proposal was seen as over-interpreting a mandate. So that's the problem Trump might have politically, is if you over-interpret your mandate, you tend to lose more seats in the midterms.
Now, a question that's related to that in my mind is, because we only have Grover Cleveland as a prior example, do we know or can we guess the difference? You know, if Trump had been reelected in 2020, we would have had 2 consecutive terms, which is what we're used to historically. And so do you think there's going to be a difference? Because is it possible that he learned something, or that the electorate learned something from the intervening 4 years? I mean, we look at Trump's team now, and he's got Democrats on there. I mean, with RFK and with Tulsi, and like there almost seems like a different mentality behind it than when we compare it to what we saw in the first term. So what are your thoughts about that?
I don't agree with that. I think that the Democrats that he has on there are kind of fringe Democrats. I think RFK Jr., okay. I don't think he would necessarily associate him as as somebody who's an establishment type of a Democrat. He ran for the Democratic nomination, didn't really pick up any support from Democrats. It was more Republicans that liked him. In Tulsi Gabbard's case, she's a refugee from the Democratic Party. I think there are very few Democrats that would associate her as a Democrat today. She was actually, interesting history. She was the number 2 person in the Democratic leadership, resigned her seat in that to support Bernie Sanders in his 2016 presidential candidate, then ran a nomination, then ran again for president in 2020. And ran again as calling himself a progressive type of a Democrat. But since Donald Trump, since then has ingratiated herself to Donald Trump and left the Democratic Party, I think very few people would associate her as a Democrat. I think if she were to pick somebody, I think it would have been more legitimate, if you will, if he were to pick somebody that's more associated with the Democratic Party. Sometimes, by the way, you have presidents picking a cabinet member from the other party or token member. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, for example, with Robert McNamara. Bill Clinton chose William Cohen, for example, the former senator from Maine. That's more in line, kind of a moderate to liberal Republican who became defense secretary.
Which Democratic Party would he be choosing from?
Who's that?
If he were to choose someone
Donald Trump, he'd be choosing somebody that's on the conservative bloodline of the Democratic Party, somebody like
centrist.
Yes, it would have to be even I don't even know if it would be a centrist much. It would be a conservative, maybe somebody that was close, somebody that resigned, somebody like perhaps Jared Goldman, who represents Northern Maine. That's the one that I would think of, or maybe someone who's a governor, maybe somebody like Laura Kelly, the governor of Kansas, would be one that I would certainly look at. Somebody who's perhaps an outgoing governor. Somebody who only has 2 years left on their term, who probably wants something else, or somebody who's run for another office, maybe someone who's run for governor, who's run for Senate, and lost to a more liberal candidate in a primary.
And so do you think about the other point with the separated terms, do you think there's an impact to that? Does it change the landscape?
I don't know. Most presidents get very supercilious in second terms. It's pretty much just about every president. You think that you're inevitable. You don't try to be modest. You think of yourself as not necessarily a transitional figure, but a transmogrificational figure, someone who's really going to change the country. So I can't imagine a scenario where he would, for example, propose a modest platform. I think whether you like the platform or don't like the platform, it's going to be very ambitious, and he's going to try to get it all done in these next 2 years, because history being the judge, he will probably lose seats in the Senate. He will probably lose the Senate, and he will probably lose the House, and he could overwhelmingly lose the House in 2018. And then by 2019, Congress has almost become irrelevant because so many members of Congress are out running for president anyways.
Right.
We were just talking about Tulsi and RFK Jr. and that makes me want to go back to the early picks that Trump's been making for the administration. So we've got Tom Homan
Yep.
in charge of the border. We've got Susie Wiles, I think, as chief of staff. And then Liz Stefanik as the UN ambassador. I don't know if there are any other appointments that I haven't heard about yet, but
He picked an EPA head too.
oh, that's right.
Lee Zeldin.
Yeah.
Lee Feldman.
What do these appointments signal to you, Rich?
Loyalty. He is not picking somebody who has been a critic of him, or somebody who is just completely completely not part of the political sphere, if you will. Somebody from, like, when Bill Clinton chose, Janet Reno as Attorney General, for example, they never met. So he's picking people that are very loyal to him. I think in the case of Elaine Stefanik, very interesting. She came to Congress, relatively moderate member from New York State, represented Fort Drum, actually, still does. Relatively moderate member. She started to move further to the right as Trump became president. And eventually, she succeeded Lynn Cheney as the chairman of the Republican conference. And she's been extremely loyal to Donald Trump. And I think that it was pretty much almost a foregone conclusion that if Donald Trump were elected, she would get some position. I don't know if United Nations was necessarily on anybody's radar. She's not necessarily known for having foreign policy prowess in terms of that being her number one kind of platform, if you will. But she's going to get that. Lee Zeldin ran for governor of New York, very loyal to Donald Trump. A congressman from New York ran overperformed, if you will, in his gubernatorial campaign. So I think that's pretty much that's pretty much a foregone conclusion. You would choose him. I think that you might see other members of Trump's inner circle potentially being nominated. I think Doug Burgum, the outgoing governor of North Dakota, who ran for president briefly last year, might become energy secretary or agriculture secretary, maybe commerce secretary. I look at Vivek Ramaswamy, who is extremely fidelitous to Donald Trump. I could see him potentially becoming commerce secretary. He's got two other options. One might be Governor DeWine could appoint him to J.D. Vance's Senate seat because he's a resident of Ohio. He could fill out that term, or he could run for governor of 2026 of Ohio as well. But I think if he wants some sort of an appointment, he can probably get it. But Marco Rubio is the one that really surprised me because his ideology is really divergent from where Donald Trump is trying to take the Republican Party.
Stefanik, I thought the UN connection's interesting to me because she was the one that grilled the presidents of Harvard and Penn and Columbia, I think, about anti-Semitism and how they weren't preventing Jewish kids from being harassed on campus. Her question was something like, is calling for the genocide of Jews against your harassment policy? And she was getting all this equivocation back, so it turned into a great soundbite. So sending her to the UN, and I mean, if that's how she feels about anti-Semitism, I think that's a great move for the United States to have a strong voice at this time.
See, in my question that I was getting ready to ask was about Alex Jones, which I saw something about him being involved as a press secretary.
Oh, no way.
Is he going to be part of the cabinet, Alex Jones?
No way.
Right.
No.
I just saw something about it as a press secretary, and I thought, there we go.
There's a Twitter poll going on from the Ivanka Trump news account, and I don't know if that has anything to do with Ivanka Trump, asking if Candace Owens should be press secretary, and all the responses I'm seeing are hell no. But
that would be really interesting. A press secretary is usually somebody who's going to have a conciliatory role with the press, who's used oftentimes from the press that they take out of the press, like Barack Obama picked Jay Carney, for example.
Huckabee didn't get that memo. Sarah
having an ideologue who has made their career out of going after Democrats, going after liberals, would really be a new type of a press secretary that I really can't think of many press secretaries in history that would have that much of it, that would be there as an adversary of the press.
That's more of a vice president's position, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, Spiro Agnew, nadering nabobs of negativity.
Exactly.
One more question on the appointments track, Rich. So Trump just tweeted Any Republican senator seeking the coveted leadership position in the United States Senate must agree to recess appointments in the Senate, without which we will not be able to get people confirmed in a timely manner. Sometimes the votes can take 2 years or more. This is what they did 4 years ago, and we cannot let it happen again. We need positions filled immediately. Additionally, no judges should be approved during this period of time because the Democrats are looking to ram through their judges as the Republicans fight over leadership. This is not acceptable. Thank you. Just quite a tweet, some random capitalization for good measure. Is this normal? What do you make of this?
No, not at all. This is recess appointments. There is a possibility that a president can nominate someone constitutionally during a recess, and they're a temporary appointment. And it's not meant to mean that the president can essentially say, oh yes, now I'm going to put everyone in that I want to have in. But theoretically it is possible. But the idea that Donald Trump is using this as leverage really shows, I think, how much he's saying that I want Rick Scott to become the Senate Majority Leader, because I cannot imagine a scenario where an institutionalist like John Thune or John Cornyn would go along with that.
And what's the implication of that? I mean, I imagine Biden and Harris, or the current administration, has ideas about what they're still going to try to get done in the next 60 days, I assume, or 45 days, whatever it is. And then Trump potentially trying to get his cabinet through. And then I don't understand, just from a pure civic standpoint, if it's really going to be up to the Senate leader to allow recess appointments, or does that sort of thing get voted on, or like how is this likely to play out?
I think the Senate leader has power in terms of he doesn't have as much power as the Speaker of the House does in terms of getting bills out of the hopper, but theoretically he could bring somebody's name up, I believe, as the majority leader, and say that we should vote on this person today. Now the real question would be, I think, can he do this with a Supreme Court justice? Let's say something happened to a Supreme Court justice, there was a death, something like to that effect. Could he bring it up and then have the Senate vote that, and then theoretically not even have committee hearings and just have it go right to the Senate and have the Senate do a vote on that? That would be a question I would have.
Do you have further comments about the Supreme Court implications of this? We've heard about, chatter about Sotomayor. Although, under 80 seems like an early retirement for a Supreme Court justice, doesn't it?
Yeah, she's 70. She has diabetes. Theoretically, in the lame duck session, she could resign, and then Chuck Schumer could bring somebody else as fast as they possibly can, maybe even not even do hearings, and then have that person nominated to become the Supreme Court justice. Of course, if you're doing that, first of all, it means you're going to have to do reconciliations. You have to be able to beat the filibuster, use a nuclear option, which is 60 votes. You have to do conciliation, and then you would have to get all 50 senators on board, which includes Joe Manchin. And if someone like the conservative Democrats turned independent to vote with you, you may have Kyrsten Sinema, who is very much a wild card. So you really have to have a unified Democratic Party to vote with them. Of course, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are both leaving the United States Senate, so they might not necessarily be looking for re-election. So potentially it might be in their best interest simply to vote for that. My guess is that's not going to happen, by the way. I think that they will wait until Donald Trump becomes president, and theoretically he could have 2 or 3 more appointments, and he really would be able to shape the court the way that, for example, Franklin Roosevelt did.
Right. And as far as that, I mean, maybe it's a little premature to talk about it, but does this set up the board for 2028 in any particular way regarding all those things? Because these are kind of the longer term implications of administration changes.
This is another thing I think that sometimes candidates talk. It's something that really appeals to the ideological basis of the parties in terms of, you're talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The average person is not thinking about a Supreme Court justice or has that much knowledge necessarily of what the Supreme Court does. They're maybe looking at economic issues. Maybe if it's something like a war overseas, that will affect them. They'd be afraid of a draft, for example, something to that effect. That might get their interest. But this is really something that's kind of been seen, even though it has broad-based implications on the American body politic. I don't think the average voter is spending a lot of time thinking about the differences between Supreme Court justices and between the restrainist ideologies or versus contextualists and all the different ideologies of the Supreme Court justice. People just don't have the time, and it's they have more more important needs that directly affect their lives.
And do you think, along those lines, do you think when Trump chose Vance, he was thinking legacy at all, and that Vance would run for president in 2028? And I mean, it's way early to imagine what that campaign would look like, but does it seem like that's what we're on track for? And what do you think about that?
Absolutely. He's looking to megafy the Republican base, the Republican Party. If he chose Marco Rubio, who's also considered to be on the short list allegedly, Marco Rubio, even though he may try to run as somewhat of a Trump Republican, he won't be a Trump Republican. He wants someone that's very much subservient to the MAGA ideology. And J.D. Vance is someone, when it comes to foreign policy issues, for example, who has very much said at one point that he doesn't care what happens in Ukraine. He's somebody who's very much of a kind of a lesser and non-interventionist. That would be somebody that would certainly keep the Trump legacy. I think that you always have a scenario when a president is up. The question is, does their vice president usually runs for re-election, and they usually have a challenge. Hubert Humphrey in '68 had Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. In 1988, George H.W. Bush was running to succeed Ronald Reagan. He had Jack Kemp, he had Al Haig, he had Peter Paul DuPont, Bob Dole running against him, and in 2000, Al Gore had Bill Bradley running against him. And so you do have somebody that's running against you if you're an incumbent vice president, but usually, and in all those cases, the incumbent vice president, they had challenges, but they'll end up being victorious at the end.
So you mentioned interventionism versus isolationism, and we touched on that a little bit last time. There might be broader topics to go into along those lines, but it just made me think of, the relationship between Musk and Trump now. So I wasn't surprised that Musk was campaigning for Trump, and that was a serious needle mover. I think it was. I think it made a huge difference. But I was really surprised to hear that Elon Musk was already on a call with Trump and Zelensky. What do you make of that? Has that happened before, where you get like somebody from the business world like joining a really sensitive foreign policy call? Like, what do you think he contributed? Maybe he was just talking about Starlink. I don't know, but what did you make of that?
I have no idea. I've never heard that in history. I doubt it's ever happened in history that you've had a businessman talking to a foreign leader. Trump's very much business oriented, and he's somebody that uses people in the private sector. For example, the My Pillow guy was one of the last people that he met with in the White House, who came in talking about different theories about the 2020 election the day before he left office, 2 days before he left office. So
yeah.
I think that this is just where Donald Trump is unconventional. Look, in our country, we've had either generals or presidents, and generals or governors or senators or politicians and generals. He's the first one that comes from a business world, and he's the first one that's never had either military or political experience. So obviously, he does something that sometimes can be very heterodox.
In the business world, when I interact with a leadership team of another company, and there are people there that don't have job titles and aren't associated with the company, but they're in the room and I don't know why they're there, or it makes me pretty uncomfortable. I imagine this, I don't know what security clearances are involved, or, it just seems like very unorthodox. So yeah, it surprised me.
Yes, absolutely, categorically.
Yeah. So you mentioned Vivek. One of his big policy ideas during his campaign was eliminating the Department of Education, and Trump released a video saying he was going to do exactly that. I don't know what all the ramifications of that are, because my understanding is the Department of Education administers federal loans to students and does a bunch of stuff other than manage money and curriculum. So what are the implications of the Department of Education going away? Do we have any idea what that's going to look like?
It's actually a pretty new department, and actually was only established by Jimmy Carter, believe it or not.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Before that, there was no Department of Education, and most education regulations are actually at the state and municipal level. So it really doesn't have as much power. It's not like it's necessarily kind of superintends the entire school system. But it certainly has some power, certainly, but it's not nearly as much power as you might think. So I think they would just go back it would just basically, at least this would be a Republican's argument. And a Republicans going back to 1996, Bob Dole campaigned on that. The argument being that the Department of Education is too expensive and we need to bring the power of education back to the states. But for the most part, it is to the states, or just some things that the federal department has power over.
Is there concern about stuff like some states deciding that their curriculum is going to include creationism and not evolution? And that all comes back, right?
That does, certainly. And theoretically, a state that is in the Bible Belt, they could make some sort of a proposal like that. And if you have a governor and a legislature that are all sympathetic, they could propose that. I think it's more likely to happen at the state level. It's more likely, I think, to happen at the municipal level, though, because as conservative as the state might be, there are very conservative parts of that state. And I can see a scenario like that happening.
Interesting. And does that, any idea how much money that saves the federal government? Because I think part of Trump's rap was that was going to help, straighten out the deficit.
I don't think so. I think that if you go back, compare it to the budget the Defense Department, even the State Department has, it's pretty de minimis comparatively speaking. I don't think it would make a much of a dent in the actual federal budget.
Got it.
So I had some questions, Rich, about the impact of technology. And, there's this idea that the generals always fight the last war.
Mm-hmm.
And we notice this phenomenon in history where, once the technology really changes, then like no amount of the old technology seems to be able to equal the tiniest amount of the new technology. For example, the best plow horse probably is going to have a hard time competing with an adequate medium priced tractor. And no matter, so on technology and particularly in journalism, I kind of got this suspicious feeling, particularly when I was hearing Hitler, 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 Hitler. It felt like whipping that plow horse to try to get it to go as fast as the tractor. Mm-hmm. And, we saw Trump embrace the wide weave and the long format new technology podcast. And we saw the Harris campaign kind of not want to go towards it, but we saw like way outspending on the old communication technology. And so I'm wondering if there's like a technological shift that's happening. 10, 12 years ago, people weren't on smartphones all the time to the same degree, or maybe it's longer. And but so I'm wondering if there's a shifting technology, if this new information revolution is giving the electorate, the body politic, like a whole new way to think about this. And was Ralph Nader said that the Dems started hiring corporate lobbyists, or not lobbyists, but corporate marketing agencies to run their elections and things like that. And I'm wondering did the technology just like shift out from under the old schoolers, do you think?
That's a great question. And it actually goes back to the 1982 midterm elections when Tony Coelho from California was the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And he was the one that really made the Democrats into a party that was very sympathetic to corporate interests. And I think that's where probably Ralph Nader and others would probably blame him for beginning that process. But it is interesting that there's always a new technology, and oftentimes candidates don't necessarily embrace the technology when it's there. Something like television, for example, worked great for John F. Kennedy, but it didn't work very well for Richard Nixon back in 1960. I think this time around, Trump, the fact that he was willing to sit there for 3 hours with Joe Rogan, it's very hard to imagine any other presidential candidate being able to do that. But on the other side of that, you had the Democrats using a lot of the traditional media, and that's certainly Joe Biden used it, Vice President Harris used it, and they used Donald Trump is very much a master, I think, at the new media, and particularly many of the conservative medias and many of the conservative many conservative sources, particularly on talk radio and podcasts as well. Trump has really been a master of sometimes calling in himself and then talking about this and about his platform. And I think by doing that, he's getting a lot of support from a lot of conservative type voters. But he also does. Trump did not campaign the old-fashioned way. The old-fashioned way is door knocking, door-to-door, shoe leather campaigns. Trump didn't do this last time. Trump didn't do this time. Trump didn't even campaign really He didn't he didn't spend very much time in Iowa, New Hampshire, for example. He's very good at wholesale campaigning instead of retail campaigning. And perhaps that's why he was at Madison Square Garden, rather speak to a large audience than kind of, walking the streets of Concord, New Hampshire, going into every muffin shop and greeting and say, "Hi, my name is Donald Trump. I'm running for president."
And is this what it's going to be now from now on, do you think?
No, I think that because we have the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary, and because they're so important, I think that the candidates are going to have at least two states that they're going to have to go to, and they're going to have to. This is on the Republican side because the Republicans have preserved the New Hampshire primary. They're going to have a scenario where every candidate is going to have to fundamentally go in different places and meet the average voter from a retail perspective. And eventually, you get to the point where this wholesale campaigning. But I think that in the Democrats, at least this time around, did not have New Hampshire as the first state. They put South Carolina as the first state. That was Joe Biden's plan, anyways. The question will be for 2028: will New Hampshire be the first state again? New Hampshire is very good at kind of culling the herd, if you will, in terms of which candidate is not going to be in the top 5, for example. But the disadvantage of having New Hampshire and Iowa is they don't have much diversity, and the advantage of having South Carolina is South Carolina, the Democratic Party, there is a large African American population specifically.
So do you think, though, that the podcast world is going to be a permanent part of the political landscape?
Oh, yeah.
So people are going to have to make it through a Joe Rogan or a Fools and Sages podcast to even have a chance at future office?
Oh, absolutely. You can't do it only by using old media and only using television, only using newspapers, and only using shoe leather campaign. And a lot of it is really, frankly, and this is what politics has really become, is the art of repetition, because you're going on the same shows, you're giving the same speeches, you have something memorized and you just have to repeat it ad nauseum. And that's a lot of what it is. So it's not necessarily that going on these new mediums, your message is going to be different. It's just a matter of who you're talking to, but you're going to be basically saying the same thing that you would be saying if it was just you giving a speech or just you in any sort of an interview with the old media.
Rogan said something different about that. He said that's true for hour 1, and that in hour 2 and hour 3, you can't keep up a facade. So if there's a facade, it's going to crack.
That's interesting.
And I think that's, I don't know. I didn't watch Harris's speeches during her campaign, but what I heard about them is that Trump was going, just rambling for an hour and a half, 2 hours about all the topics that were of interest to him. But she was doing really precise, like 15 minutes. Here's what I've got. Read it off the teleprompter and out the door. And apparently she told Rogan she would do 45 minutes with him. And in DC, not in Austin. And he said, yeah, we got to do it my way or it's not really going to work,
And they wanted editing too, right? And so I'm wondering, is the electorate craving this kind of authenticity that you can only get in like a Fools and Sages or a Joe Rogan setting?
I don't know. I don't know how many people would want to necessarily. I mean, obviously it was millions and millions of people, like 36 million, that listened to Donald Trump, which amazes me because people have very short attention spans. And the fact
49 now, I think.
People, wow, that's amazing that people would actually be would want to watch something for that long of a period of time. That really amazes me. That's why sound bites, for example, politicians are taught to talk in sound bites for about 10 seconds because they know that that's what the coverage is going to pick up. And that's why you have all these 30-second ads. But the idea that someone would actually want to listen to a 3-hour interview is really, I mean, I guess it's advantageous for the human being's attention span that they would be willing to follow it for that long.
Yeah. Cool. Rich, is there anything we haven't asked you that you think we should have, or that you an insight that you want to drop on us? Did Fox ask you anything better that we haven't touched on?
So it's just on Live Fox because breaking news, and the breaking news is that Donald Trump nominated Marco Rubio to become United States Secretary of State. I think one thing that's very interesting is Donald Trump seems to be willing to pick members of Congress and pick current people that are currently in office in Congress. And sometimes if he picks too many House members, what's going to happen is not that in the meantime, those seats are going to be vacant. And it's going to make it harder for him to get his legislation through. He's already, for example, talked about Mike Waltz joining the administration, and he's talked about Elise Stefanik joining the administration, those are going to be two seats that are going to be open because we're going to have a special election, and theoretically, it's going to make it harder for him to get the legislation through. I thought that since Congress was so bifurcated, it would be. I thought he was going to try to stay off of the House. The Senate's easier because in the Senate's case, you're just taking members out that have Republican governors. So you take a state like Oklahoma or Florida. If Ron DeSantis will invariably choose the successor of Marco Rubio, but when you're taking members out of the House of Representatives, you're also losing a seat.
Speaking of DeSantis, do you think he'll be back maybe as a J.D. Vance VP nominee?
No, I don't know what he would necessarily add. I think he's kind of seen as yesterday's news. I think that he made a huge mistake running for president this past time. I think that had he served out his term and then run in 2028, maybe he would have even been seen as more the MAGA hair, if you will, of J.D. Vance. Now, I think a lot of Trump people will see him as disloyal because he ran against Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump will do everything he possibly can to make sure he doesn't garner the nomination. I don't see what he actually adds as a vice presidential pick either, other than he's governor from a relatively red state, and he's very divisive. I think J.D. Vance would rather choose somebody that's probably not from Florida, and probably somebody who is who is less interventionist in foreign policy than Governor Ron DeSantis.
So I don't remember if we covered this. Should we expect the GOP to just be MAGA-fied for the near future to the horizon, or what do you think?
I do think
Pretty
so.
much.
It's very hard to see a scenario where 2028, the Republicans nominate somebody from the George W. Bush era, for example, who had that previous ideology. It's probably going to be somebody, if it's J.D. Vance or if it's somebody else, it's probably going to be someone in J.D. Vance's mold. And also, I think a lot of the House and Senate candidates in 2026 will be people that are in J.D. Vance and Donald Trump's mold. Some of the people that got elected this time around, like Bernie Moreno in Ohio, for example, were very much Donald Trump Republicans. So these are people who are very loyal to Donald Trump. I think that if there's anybody who's running as an establishment Republican that's going to praise George W. Bush, for example, in 2026, they're not going to win the nomination. And if they do win the nomination, Donald Trump will certainly not spend time campaigning for them.
So that old school Republican is pretty much a history now.
Well,
I did have the thought that maybe the Cheneys and all of the McConnell Democrats could reform a Democrat-Republican Party.
I don't think so, because they'd have to work, obviously with Democrats, and I think that they would know. I mean, you'd have some sort of a centrist party. Most people that are in the Democratic Party are pretty loyal to the Democratic Party, even the most conservative members that are there right now. Theoretically, you could have somebody like Kirsten Sinema, that would want to form some sort of a third party with someone like Lynn Cheney, but I just don't see that, because I think that they know that, at least in the American politics, third parties tend to be spoilers, and there's really no signs in American history of a third party that's been successful. Now you have ranked choice voting or something like that, instant runoff voting.
Right.
Then you can vote for a third party, but right now the system is just, there's so many hoops you have to pass through that the two parties are so hegemonic.
Will those old school Republicans find a place in the current Democratic Party or the new incarnation?
Yeah, a lot of them are. I mean, neoconservatives, folks like Billiam Crystal, the publisher of the very neoconservative publication, if you remember, the Weekly Standard, who was one of the main advocates during the Bush administration of the Iraq War. What happened was, after the first Gulf War, there was after the Cold War, rather, there was a split in the Republican Party between traditional conservatives like Pat Buchanan, who wanted non-interventionist foreign policy, and the neocons like William Crystal, who wanted a very much interventionist foreign policy. Rather, Pat Buchanan wanted a non-interventionist foreign policy. The interventionists are now part of the Harris administration, or supporting the Harris administration. Bill and Crystal, Lynn Cheney, Dick Cheney, a lot of the folks at this magazine called Bulwark, which is very much kind of a successor, if you will, to the Weekly Standard, to kind of anti-Trump Republicans, have become members of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, rather, which bodes well for Democrats trying to get centrist voters. But it doesn't bode well, I think, if the Democrats are trying to maintain their base. I can see where that could depress the base, theoretically. Specifically, right. If someone like a Jill Stein comes out and says, you have neoconservatives on your side, this makes you a warmonger party. So it's a delicate balance.
Right. That's what I was wondering, whether it increased that pressure to fragment into interest groups. Yeah. Well, what do you think? Did we squeeze all the juice out of this fruit?
I think we squeezed all the blood out of the turnip, as Bill Clinton said.
Yeah, I think that was a good summary. Thank you so much. I know it's real late where you are, Rich. I appreciate you staying up and talking with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. I greatly appreciated it.
Well, and we hope that as this unfolds, I'm sure it's going to be stranger than fiction. And so we hope we can check in with you in the future. Folks have really enjoyed it, and we've gotten good feedback.
Sounds wonderful.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, guys.